There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth. I am your host for today's episode, Nikki Ivy with Sweetfish Media. I've got with me today Mike Adams, who is CEO of The Story Leader, also author of 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. Mike, how you doing today?
I'm doing fantastically well, Nikki. I'm in the dark in Melbourne early in the morning, and I think I'm a day ahead of you. We're ahead of you in Australia.
Ooh, Mike's in the future, guys.
I'm in the future.
No, he's got some really, really exciting stuff to talk about, a subject really close to my heart, storytelling. And Mike's going to help us answer the question today, why can't your team sell like you can? But before we get into that, Mike, I'd love to have you just give us a little background on yourself and what you and the team have been up to these days.
Sure. I'll give you a little story. Why not? So I'm an electrical and mechanical engineer that should not have been a salesperson. It should not have been someone who ended up selling more than $1 billion worth of stuff all over the world in 5 different industries. I think I lived in 9 different countries. But back in the mid-90s, in 1996, I was working on some fancy software. I was working in the oil and gas industry. I was in the software division. My job was to actually operate software called a neural network, something that's quite popular these days, but didn't work in 1996. And my boss called me and he said, Mike, we have this great career opportunity for you. And there's always alarm bells in big corporations because career opportunity usually means the job nobody else wants, right? But that was to go to Norway. I was in London, and that was to go to Norway and be a salesperson. And I said, ooh, I want to go to Norway. And I thought, but I don't want to be a salesperson. And what I said was, well, I can't go. My wife is 8 months pregnant. But I went home that night and she said, oh yeah, I wanted to go to Norway too. So she flew on the last day that she could fly with our second son. Our second son was born in Norway. He has blonde hair, coincidentally. But I got a sales job. I was not a very good salesperson at all because engineers tend to be very analytical and we want to solve problems before the client gives us the permission to solve the problem. But I did sell the biggest deal worldwide in our company in our first year just by accident. It was pure luck. It really was. It truly was luck. I just met the right client. And that's what kept me in sales. I loved it. And I ended up running sales teams all over Europe and in Russia. We moved to Russia. We had 3 boys by then. And then after nearly 17 years living all over the world, we went back to Australia and I needed to change industry because we chose to live in Melbourne. There's no oil and gas industry in Melbourne, so I had to change industry. And I was pretty concerned because I kind of thought of myself as an oil and gas person. But I got a job in telecoms selling really big ticket items, more than $100 million deals in telecommunications equipment for a really big conglomerate. And I used storytelling to get that job, and I used storytelling to learn how to sell quickly because if you change industry as a salesperson, you've probably got about 8 months to prove that you can do what they think you can do, but you don't know anything. You don't know your company, you don't know your client, you don't know your products and services, you don't know a thing. And in fact, you don't even know what you don't know. And so you're not speaking the right language. But if you understand what sort of stories you need to find about your client and your own company and your products and services, then you can succeed. And And I did that 5 more times. I changed industry, complete new industries, and I figured out how to sell. And then I started consulting in 2014, pretty much realized that it's impossible to teach salespeople anything at all, but they do like to listen to stories. So they like stories. So if I teach them using the stories and I tell them something like, well, look, I know you already use stories because all the good salespeople do. And I tell that same thing to the bad salespeople. And then here's a little structure that you can use. And these are the types of stories that I've found really work. And they love that. They pick up on that. So sales people are very open to the idea of storytelling because they know that that's part of the mystery of what they do. And that's what I've been doing since 2014. I wrote 7 stories every salesperson must tell last year. It's been going really well. In fact, it sells very well in the United States. That's the land of self-help and sales. So it's going really well. And what I do today is I consult with companies that have sales teams. I come in, I use storytelling to inspire them a little bit, but mostly I'm teaching them what a story really is, what the structure is, and the sorts of stories they need to get from connecting with the right client, building rapport, showing that they're an authority, changing the client's mind, because that's what we do in sales. We change our customer's mind, and then helping them actually make the decision, close the deal. And stories can help you all the way through that process. And the 7 stories in 7 stories are the 7 stories to get you from first contact to close deal. It's built around a buying cycle. So that's what I do. I have a great job. I do that all over the world. And I just fly around and tell stories and help people tell stories and hear some fabulous stories from my clients.
I love it. There's so much in there that you just gave me. So, I mean, I'll start with agreeing with you that it is really tough to teach as a salesperson. Yes, it's tough to teach us some things. At the same time, though, I think it comes from this idea of wanting to come across as experts. Or that sort of being what like you said, the self-help or the professional development, that sort of being the theme of all of that, right? That coupled with how much activity we can get out and depending on what the culture is of the company, you can get lost in just that, right? How many calls do I have to make to get to a conversation? How many conversations to get to a meeting? How many? And if you're focused on that, it can be even going into a cold call or a conversation, it can be really easy to lose that sense of sincerity and sort of groundedness that's necessary to tell these stories. And so you have really high potential salespeople, and the numbers bear this out, a lot of the time not hitting quota or not reaching what they want to accomplish. And you've got a lot of salespeople asking this question: why can't your sales team sell like you can? And that's the question that you answered. To dig into that for me, Mike.
Yeah, that's the very common frustration of business owners and sales leaders, because very often those are the people that built the business. You know, if you take your typical CEO founder, companies are built on stories. You know, those people, if they are not the storyteller themselves, they have one. They have a co-founder that's a storyteller, that was the business developer. This is like, I've never found this not to be the case. But very often it's an unconscious skill. They don't know that they're doing it. And their staff, rather than thinking, they're telling those great stories, they think, I've heard that 50 times before. So they're kind of like rolling their eyes, you know. But the clients, of course, haven't heard those stories before, you know. So when the founder's going in and telling these little anecdotes, these stories, they're highly engaging. And what the business owner usually doesn't appreciate is it's those stories that are doing the selling for them. And the rest of the team don't really know those stories well enough to tell them themselves. It's one thing to tell a story about what happened to you. It's more difficult to tell the story of the founder, of the other people, because you've got to put a different character in the story. And that's what I teach. So of the 7 stories, only one of them is your personal story. And the other 6 are stories that have a different central character. It might be your product developer or your CEO or your company or the values, someone who demonstrated the values of your company, how you behave. So that's a different character. So salespeople need to learn how to tell other people's stories. But we only ever tell true stories. This is a really important point. We don't ever make up stories or elaborate. We just tell true stories because our credibility is shot to pieces the instant we tell something that the client can check and find out, oh, that wasn't true. And this is a really important point. And the other thing, Nikki, that's really worth saying is that, if you went back 10, 15 years and said storytelling in business, a lot of senior leaders would just push back because they would think story is something you make up. And it's not that at all. What story is a sequence of related events. So I told you that in the 1990s, I was an engineer and I was in the UK and I moved to Norway and then I started running sales teams and then I had to come back to Australia. Because of that, this sequence. That's what a story is. If it hasn't got that, it isn't a story at all. It's just not a story. But nowadays you hear a lot of people and a lot of marketers, I'm sorry to say, writing things like our story, our company story, and it's not a story. It's just facts. They might say we were founded in the year 2000. Good, that could be the start of a story. And then they say, and now we're the number one company in the world. Well, that's not a story. You just told me two unrelated facts. You didn't tell me how you got there. I want to know the story, right? So it's a misunderstood word now. And really in sales storytelling, we're talking about quite short anecdotes. We're not talking about a big Hollywood production, the fabulous hero's journey and all that. We're just talking about little anecdotes that make a business point. That's really important.
What I keyed in on what you just said is this idea that these stories typically are unconscious. It really reminds me of one of my first sales jobs where I was sort of learning the power of storytelling. I had, when I first moved to Omaha, Nebraska, I was moving there to marry my husband. And I was putting together a wedding. Cool. I'd been doing a sort of long distance, right? And I remember calling around to wedding entertainment, right? DJs and MCs and things like that, and videographers. And I'd call this place and they gave me a price. And I just thought, that's too much. So never mind. So I ended up, cut to my wedding reception. There was no music, and the burden of entertaining all these people who'd come for a celebration was on me or my family. And it just hit me in that moment. Like, that's why this sort of thing is important. I just sort of put that in the back of my mind. And then a few years later, I happened to get an opportunity on the sales team for that entity that was, selling, like I said, wedding event services. And when I got folks in front of me, and I got, brides in front of me and grooms in front of me, I would tell that story. And the way they responded to it, getting them to see themselves on their wedding day at the reception, God forbid, not dancing, not, being able to just be in the moment because they were attending to folks. And it really drove it home more than anything that I could have done by, showing them some video of somebody else's wedding or,
correct,
talking about the price or whatever it is. And so I was like, there's something to this. But the way that I told the story and sold that product was so different from what everyone else was doing, because again, it's difficult if you don't have a story, if those still part of the culture of the company. What we're talking about is alignment between leadership and the salespeople in understanding how those stories create the culture of the company. And then, like you and I talked about offline, alignment between sales and marketing. So
yes.
How does talking about how does understanding this concept of storytelling and the power of it, how does it advance that initiative of sales and marketing alignment?
Yeah, and that's really important. And I want to pick up one thing on your story because I love listening to stories. And we don't just tell stories; we tell stories to get a story. So we want to exchange stories actually in sales conversations. So I want to tell a story so that I hear the client's story. Mm-hmm. You told a wonderful story about your personal experience not being able to afford them, and then probably not realizing how important it was, and maybe you should have found the money to get that right. Entertainment. Now, the difference between you a few years later as a salesperson trying to tell some facts about to a bride and a bride and groom, these are the things you should have, mm-hmm. and you telling your story. This is the difference. When you tell your story, you give them an experience of what it was like to be you in that situation. And that's truly what stories do. Stories allow us to transplant someone else's experience into the minds of our clients in a way that they're just really happy to listen to. So that's a beautiful thing. So that bride was able to imagine herself as you in your story and go, I really wouldn't want that later, right? And changed her mind. That's not done without the story. So that's just a beautiful example of how experiences are shared in story, which is fundamental to how our human brain works, actually. Mm-hmm. And I love that example. So I just didn't want to let that pass. So let's go to marketing and sales. Marketing depends on how big the company is, and companies have different meanings, different conceptions of what marketing is. Most companies have a fairly common conception of what sales is. Sales are the people who have the conversations with the client to help change their mind and understand the client and get the sale done. Some salespeople are doing the same job day in, day out. Some have to sell new products and services, but less that's what sales does. Marketing has to create a sort of a one-to-many conversation to the market to prepare the market for the salespeople. And marketing departments, when they think about selling, and when they think about storytelling, they're usually telling sort of brand stories. This is the story of our brand, and this is how our brand helps our client, right? So they have this high level, I would say quite exotic story, whereas salespeople are telling just these little anecdotes, like your anecdote of what happened to you so that think of the salespeople as telling tactical stories, and the marketing people are trying to set this big strategic story. Here's the issue. The issue is that sales leaders, and I'm being a generalist here, and I was one of these people, and I think I was the same. Sales leaders are pretty poor at systems. They're not great systems thinkers as a rule. They're more get in and I'll help sell kind of people usually, because they're usually salespeople. So they don't think about how do I create a system so that new salespeople can come in, easily learn the stories and tell those stories. But marketing people are good systems thinkers. So what we need the marketing people to create the system, which is the story library, for capturing these anecdotes, the anecdotes from the CEO, from the best salespeople, from the product development people, get all of the different 7 story types into a story library so the salespeople can use them. And that's a really good way to think about marketing and sales alignment. The good salespeople have the stories, but marketing should be the owner of those stories and should be the corporate knowledge of those stories back to the whole team. That's how I view it.
Perfect. No, this is the type of people who listen to this show probably get sick of hearing me use this phrase, but I talk less about alignment and more about sales and marketing harmony. And that is what you just described. I think it's so important. I love this space so much that I kind of want what's best for it, right? And this is how we elevate this thing. It really does all come back to the fact that we're talking about B2B, we're talking about B2C, we're really talking about P2P, right? Person to person.
Correct.
And that's what it comes down to. So I'm really glad. I want to get one more thing before we run out of time. You talked about the story library. What do folks most commonly miss when they're trying to build their story library? And what do you think should be the center or the cornerstone story type for your one story library?
The stories are simple anecdotes, most of them. You know, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in 7 stories in my book, you'll read what the elements are, because you can go wrong. You can make mistakes with these stories, but they're little anecdotes. And the story library, the quickest way to build your story library is to hold your smartphone in front of your CEO or, the person who's telling the story and go and record it. And if it's more than 3 minutes long, it's probably too long. So have another go. Just record it and upload the video. So just make your story library videos of people telling the stories. Here's how we won the business at this client, and tell the story. But tell the story from the client's perspective. So you just start building up. And once you've got to 10 or 15, people get the idea, and then they just start refreshing the stories in the story library. So it doesn't have to be a hugely expensive thing. You just have to recognize that these stories are so powerful, we've got to make sure everybody hears them. And so you capture them. That's it.
Fascinating. I think I've seen this done well once in my very short lived.
Almost no one does this well.
Yeah.
It's a huge opportunity. It's a huge opportunity for sales leaders and marketing. And I gave salespeople a bad rap for not being good systems people. But if I was to generalize about marketing people, they're actually not so good at going and talking to clients, in my opinion. The salespeople do that day in, day out. They are good at that. So the marketing need that access to the sales for the real conversations, the real stories that are happening, right? So there is a synergy required. They need to help each other. Marketing needs sales support to have those stories and to hear them. And sales needs marketing support for systems thinking and creating the system that will work.
Yeah, no, it's a very symbiotic relationship. It's like me and my husband, where
yes,
I speak about 10,000 words a minute, and he's just making sure that everything is taken care of.
Thank goodness he can listen at that rate, maybe.
Somehow we keep it all together. So I've had a really good time picking your brain. There's so much more I think that I and our audience could learn from you, and we'll get to how they can connect with you later on. But real quick, I wanted to know, now that I've sort of seen what I could get out of the mind of you, I'm interested in what you're putting in it. Mike, what is a learning resource that you've engaged with recently that's either informed your approach or just got you excited these days?
Well, my primary learning source is YouTube, believe it or not. I can lose myself in an intellectual question on YouTube and just go deep. And I'm still an engineer at heart. And if I find myself interested in something, which is, for example, neuroscience. I'm really interested in the neocortex and how artificial intelligence is teaching us how our mind really works, because I want to know why stories really work. And it's not the traditional answer about emotion and all that. Stories really work because we have this neocortex, which is the outer wrinkly part of our brain, about 3/4 of our brain. And most people don't know what that does. But what it does is it memorizes patterns, sequences in the environment, and predicts what's going to happen next. And your audience were probably predicting that I was going to say the word next, but I left a little gap. So you're going, well, is he going to say next? So you're predicting. And stories are sequences of events that are, by definition, unpredictable. And as we listen to stories, we want to predict what's going to happen next. And I'm really interested in the neuroscience of that. So I read neuroscience papers on that, but I use YouTube to get I listen to the real experts in the field on YouTube, or then I go online and I read their papers, and that's how I learn. So I can learn I think anyone can learn a huge amount about anything with Google and YouTube and archive and reading papers. You can be an expert in anything. It's amazing what you can do these days that you couldn't do 10 years ago.
Yeah, no, I tell my kids this all the time when they ask me questions. I'm that mom. I'm like, the information is literally at your fingertips.
Yeah, in more detail than you could ever consume,
I won't do this question as much, Jen. I can tell you my experience, but how about we, have some enthusiasm about learning? So
yeah,
it's like probably a really nerdy thing to say, but I'm saying it to someone who studies neuroscience. So I'm guessing you'll forgive the nerdiness.
No, it's a perfect answer. And I read a lot of books. I do, I do have a whole stack of sales books there, and I love to read them. But I also like to read books on psychology, on neuroscience, on artificial intelligence, all sorts of things, on general business as well, not just sales, because I think it's important to understand business if you're in sales and marketing.
For sure. I'm the same way. So tell me this, how can folks connect with you?
Okay, so having just said that, they're going to go to their Google search engine and type Mike Adams storytelling, and there would be a minimum of 10 pages of all the ways they can find me. They will see my book in audio, in softback, hardback, ebook. They'll see our online training courses on storytelling. They'll see lots of articles on newspapers and all that kind of stuff. So they'll be able to check me out.
All right. You guys heard it here. That's how you catch up with this guy. This has been so much fun. One of my favorites. Don't tell the other guests. I hope to have you on again here in the future, talk more about this stuff, because there was, again, so much more that I didn't even get to ask you. Thanks so much for being on today, Mike.
Nikki, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with.
That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.